Look at me at a podium. This is hilarious. First of all, only my head sticks out of the top, okay? It's me, I'm behind the podium. I'm Kate Baker Demers. I'm the Executive Director of Children's Scholarship Fund in New Hampshire, and today I have the honor of introducing my good friend, Corey DeAngelis. Corey DeAngelis is the National Director of Research for the American Federation for Children, and the Executive Director at the Education Freedom Institute. He's also a big fan of New Hampshire, big fan of Live Free or Die State, and a big fan of our education freedom accounts. Corey is also an adjunct scholar at Cato, Senior Research Fellow at Reason Foundation. He was named on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. Also, congratulations for that, Corey. He received a Buckley Award from America's Future in 2020, and he received a Future 40 Award from the Maverick PAC in 2021. So lots of accolades for Corey. He's authored and co-authored 40 articles, journal articles, book chapters, and reports on education policy. He's the co-editor of School Choice Myths, the book, right? So go on to Amazon. You can get your book on Amazon, right, Corey? Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. His research has been published in peer review academic journals, including Social Science Quarterly, School Effectiveness and School Improvement, and Education Review. He's a regular on Fox News, which is always fun to see my friend Corey on Fox News. It has been published also in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New York Post, and National Review. He has a PhD in education policy from the University of Arkansas and a couple of other degrees. And with no further ado, my friend Corey DeAngelis. It looks like you might be trapped.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Oh.
This way?
Yeah. Did you call me a junk scholar earlier? I'm glad you didn't call me Dr. DeAngelis because I'm not a real doctor. I'm more like a Jill Biden doctor. I have a PhD in education policy, so I can't help you if you have any medical issues in the back of the room. But if you need help with, Pythagorean theorem or some math, I might be able to help you out. But that's actually quite questionable at all as well because I went to government schools for 13 years growing up. So I might actually not be able to tell you that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But thank you so much, Kate. I am a friend of New Hampshire. New Hampshire has had one of the biggest victories when it came to expanding educational freedom with the education freedom accounts as well. And a lot of people have been trying to tell me to move here since I'm not too far away. I'm in D.C. And after the past couple of years living in D.C., it's becoming more and more enticing with all of the restrictions. They just lifted the mask mandate March 1st in D.C., and people who live in my same condo building almost voted to keep the mask mandate, even though the government wasn't telling them we had to anymore. Some people are so bought into that they still want it. I think the vote was like 53% to 47%. We just got it by the skin of our teeth. But our flight is actually delayed today, so we might be stuck in New Hampshire anyway. So there's a higher power telling us that we have to stay here in New Hampshire. So maybe we will, and maybe that'll give us some more time to explore. But who here has heard of school choice? Yeah, shit. I don't have to do a lot of convincing with this crowd, do I? And if you've read School Choice Myths, there are so many arguments that you hear over and over again against allowing the funding to follow the child, and I'll go over a couple of those in a second, but I really want to start out by just pointing out that it is a really good time to be a school choice advocate, or an advocate of allowing the funding to follow the child to wherever they get an education. And the reason that I say that is, the way that I put it before, is that COVID didn't break the government school system, it was already broken. And they are government schools. They're not public schools. They're not public goods. They're rivalrous and excludable. They are not accountable to the public. They're not open to the public, especially over the past couple of years. They were closed. They're not. They discriminate by zip code in some cases. They are run by the government. They are funded by the government, or at least the taxpayer. They're regulated by the government. They are assigned by the government. They're compelled by the government. They are government schools. Stop calling them public schools. I need to correct myself on that sometimes as well. But look, over the past couple of years, people had their eyes opened to the problems with the government-run school system. A lot of people in this room already understood these problems, but it became more and more obvious to so many people. I mean, it's one thing for a failing government institution to get your children's education dollars, regardless of your choice in the matter and regardless of how well they did. But it's another conversation altogether for those same failing government buildings to continue to receive your kids' education dollars regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. You had the private schools fighting as hard as possible to reopen, or they were open the entire time. You had the government schools fighting for the opposite. In some places, you even had the board member at the Chicago Teachers Union, for example, railing against going back to work in person while taking Instagram photos poolside in Puerto Rico. Wait, if it's safe enough to vacation in person, why wasn't it safe enough to go back to work in person? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. It's more enjoyable to go to vacation in Puerto Rico than it is to go back to work. And it wasn't because the people in the system were bad or they had bad intentions. They didn't want to hurt kids with school closures. There was a difference of incentives, that one of those sectors received your kids' education dollars regardless of whether they opened their doors for business. And it was actually worse than that in the government schools. They're asking for school choice up here in the front row. All right, good thing you're in New Hampshire because we have some educational freedom in this state. But the teachers' union started to understand that it wasn't just that they could keep their benefits the same in terms of job security and pay without providing the full set of services. It's that they understood that they could actually financially benefit from keeping the schools closed, because they could lobby to the government and say, we're closed because we don't have enough money. Even though New Hampshire was already spending over $19,000 per student per year in the government school system, according to the U.S. Census Bureau's data from 2019. It's obviously a lot higher now because the federal government passed at least $190 billion since March of 2020 for COVID relief. And now the schools have so much money, they don't even know what to do with it. My mom's actually works in the public school system, in the government school system in Texas, and she's telling me that they're buying all these smart boards and stuff and just putting them into empty rooms because they don't know what to do with the money. The Associated Press even reported that they were spending the money on football stadiums and whatnot. And great if you like football, but the reason for this funding was that you had to get the schools open. But the reality is none of this was ever about safety and the needs of families. It was more about politics and power. And so this turned out to be about $3,000 to $4,000 per student per year nationwide since March of 2020 being allocated to K-12 education. The first study that I did on the topic that everybody in this room would probably reply, and maybe some of you did on Twitter, by saying, why did we need a study for this? There's been 7 studies now finding that places with stronger teachers' unions were less likely to reopen their schools in fall of 2020. Why in the hell did I spend 50 pages writing an article on that? I don't know, but it's because people on the other side will say, oh, prove it, that didn't actually happen. Well, so anybody with 2 brain cells can figure out that, well, of course, if the unions were pushing to keep the schools closed, if they had more sway in a particular area, of course, they were more likely to get what they wanted. And we saw this, them overplaying their hand in so many places. Think about Los Angeles public schools. Did anybody see their report on safely reopening schools? And they called for Medicare for all, a wealth tax. You have to have police-free schools as well, which you can argue if these things are good or bad, but this is in your report on safely reopening the schools. You're just asking for all these political things that you always wanted. But the good news is that the teachers' unions have finally overplayed their hand, showed their true colors, and awakened a sleeping giant. Parents who want more of a say in their kids' education. And the number of states with these education freedom accounts, which New Hampshire is the only place that has an education freedom account. Other states call them education savings accounts. Who's familiar with what an education freedom or savings account is? Everybody's familiar with Milton Friedman's kind of voucher idea, right? The money that would have followed you to the government school, you could take it to a private school to pay for tuition and fees. An advancement from that is these things called education savings or freedom accounts. I like the freedom account name. It's much better, because a lot of these you can't even roll over the funding in some of the places, so it's not even really a savings account. But the money that would have followed your child to the government-run school, you could still take it there if you like, if they're doing a good job. If you like your public school, you could keep your public school. For real this time, though, unlike with the doctor thing a few years ago. But the money that would have followed your child to the government-run school will go to this savings or scholarship account, whatever you want to call it, and you could still use the funding for private school tuition and fees like the Milton Friedman voucher idea, but you could also use it for any other approved education expenditure. So that could be a micro school, a pandemic pod, private tutor, homeschooling curriculum types of expenses. Kate probably has so many more examples of types of expenses that they've approved through the scholarship granting organization, which is another thing that's interesting about New Hampshire. had the only tax credit scholarship program that allowed for homeschooling expenses. Every other one that I've seen all across the nation only allowed you to pay for private school tuition and fees. So New Hampshire was kind of ahead of the ball even before the pandemic started with this customizable type of school choice, or we can even call it education choice, or if you just want to call it education freedom. And the number of these states that had these types of programs doubled in 2021 alone, from 5 states to 10 states. New Hampshire being one of the states that got a new education savings or freedom account program. And the number of states that had some type of expansion where the funding followed the child in 2021 alone was 19 states, including New Hampshire, expanding educational freedom in 2021. It was a huge uptick and shift of momentum. The previous legislative session, there was only one state, Utah, that had a new private school choice program, which was a tax credit scholarship program. And polling has been through the roof as well. The latest Real Clear Opinion Research polling, for example, has found an 8 percentage point increase in support of the funding following the child, between from 64% support in April of 2020 to 72% support among the general public across the nation in February of 2022. Texas primaries just happened in the Republican Party last week, and they had a Proposition 9, a school choice question on there. And the percentage of people supporting the money following the child in the Texas Republican primary was about 88%, which was a 9 percentage point uptick since 2018. When they last did it, was about a 79% support of the concept of the money following the child. So we have polling on our side. We've had expansions on the ground with legislation. We've even had people pushing the ball even further in New Hampshire with this local opt-in. So if you're not familiar too much with the education freedom accounts in New Hampshire, it's only the state portion of total funding, which happens to be on average about a quarter of total funding. Government schools spend over $19,000 a year. The freedom accounts are about $4,600 per kid on average. And Kate's been doing a great job on this and has already had, 2,100 applications approved, about over 2,000? So that's 1.3% of the public school population. So that's a huge change in a short amount of time. And there's also been a spike in homeschooling, even without the education freedom accounts. Nationwide, there's been at least a doubling of homeschooling, not defined as government schooling at home, but actually not being enrolled in a public or private school. A doubling since pre-pandemic period, and there's been a mass exodus from the government school system. About 3% of the school-age population has left government schools nationwide. That happens to be about 1.5 million students have left the government school system nationwide since pre-pandemic levels. So there's been a lot of change in the opinions of people, legislation on the ground, movement with your feet. Frank Edelblue, Commissioner of Education here, pointed out on our panel earlier that it's only been 3% in New Hampshire. Why isn't it like 30%? Look, we had this school closures, well, that was before every single family was allowed to take their kids' education dollars elsewhere. Just imagine if even half of the total, $9,000 followed the child, $10,000. Just imagine how much more that shift would have been if people could actually take their money elsewhere. So you're having these huge shifts even without a large degree of educational freedom. So people all across the nation have started to figure out that there isn't any good reason to fund failing government buildings when you can fund students directly instead. And what's interesting to me is that I don't even really call it school choice anymore. I start calling it in terms of funding students instead of systems, allowing the funding to follow the child, because it's more direct and transparent. And what I'm talking about is that we have the funding going to these government buildings. Let's just have it follow wherever the child and family wants to take the funding, public or private. And what's interesting is that a lot of the same people who oppose the funding following the child for K-12 education, they support it for programs with higher education. Think about the Pell Grant for low-income families or students. Think about the GI Bill for veterans. The funding doesn't go straight to the community college or straight to a residentially assigned government-run provider of higher education. Instead, the funding goes to the student, and then they can choose public or private, religious or non-religious universities. It doesn't have to go to one particular place. The same kind of logic applies to pre-K programs, including the federal Head Start program. the money doesn't go straight to a residentially assigned government-run provider of pre-K services. Instead, the family has a choice in the matter: public, private, religious, non-religious. The same logic applies to essentially every other industry. Think about Medicaid funding. You could take the funding to a private, religious, Catholic hospital. There's one nearby here that we drove by the other night. Think about food stamps. Just imagine if we forced low-income families to take their food stamp dollars to a residentially assigned government-run provider of groceries. And whether you're for or against the amount of funding that is allocated to food stamps, I'm not making an argument as to whether we should have those or not. My argument is that if we're going to spend the money, I think we can all agree, whether you're for or against spending the money in the first place, it should go to people instead of government buildings. And so you have the same people supporting all these other programs coming out and screeching whenever there's someone that suggests allowing the funding to follow the child when it comes to the in-between years of K-12 education, which raises a question. Why would you support one of these things and not the other? Well, the answer to everyone in here, it's pretty obvious. There's a difference in power dynamics. Choice is the norm for the most part with higher education, pre-K, and everything else, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest only when it comes to K-12 education. So they fight as hard as possible, the teachers' unions and other government employee unions, against any change to the status quo. And they repeat the same BS arguments each and every year. And the one that you'll hear over and over, you heard it here in New Hampshire, you hear it in every single state. It's why my job's so easy, actually, because my ideological opponents are intellectually bankrupt. They just repeat the same things over and over again, no matter how false it is. And in every state, it's the same argument. It's, well, school choice sounds great and all, but school choice defunds the public schools. Anybody hear that? First of all, get the wording right. It's a government school, not a public school. But look, school choice doesn't steal money from the public schools. If anything, government schools steal money from families. School choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners, or at least the intended beneficiaries of the funding. Education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, public or private. The funding should follow the individual. No one would ever argue that allowing families to choose their grocery store, even if they're using taxpayer funding like food stamps, no one would ever say that that steals money from Walmart or Safeway. Why would no one ever say that? Well, because we all understand that the funding is meant for the family to provide for their children. It's not meant to prop up a building. Yeah, I know. It's a ridiculous argument from the teachers union, isn't it? But they essentially are implying that your kids and the money that's meant for educating them belongs to their institutions. Our side says, no, hold up. It doesn't belong to your government buildings. If anything, if it doesn't go back to the taxpayer, it should at least go to the parents and let them decide for their own kids. The second response I have to this argument, one is it's not your money in the first place. Two is this is what usually gets me blocked on Twitter. If you're following me on Twitter, you've probably seen this over and over again where I'll just say, oh man, they accidentally blocked me for some reason. But I'll respond by saying, why would this happen? Why would giving families a choice defund public schools? They can't answer that. And so they block or they'll pivot to another argument. But the thing is, what I'm trying to point out with that rhetorical question is that you're telling on yourself. You understand that families aren't happy with what they're getting, and you're arguing that you should force disproportionately low-income families to stay in those failing government buildings regardless of what the families actually want. That's an argument for choice, not an argument against it. So they only have two ways to get out of this. They have two responses that they can come back with besides a block, which is, one, they'll say, well, it's because families will choose the private schools. Yeah, exactly. That's my argument for school choice. Thank you for making my argument for me. You understand that parents aren't happy. You understand that you're not doing a good job. You understand that families want something else. Well, then let them have it. The other response is something they don't say very often, but when they let the mask slip, it's actually pretty glorious and it goes viral. This happened in the Kentucky legislature last year. One of the opponents of the education freedom bill out there said, well, these are low-income families. Do we really expect them to shop around? Yes, I do. They shop around with everything else. They can figure it out, and they know more about their own kids' needs than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. Parents know their kids better than anybody else. Let them pick. It doesn't matter what their income level is. And so when this paternalistic argument comes out, it really blows up in their face, and let them have it. This is why they don't like to respond to this rhetorical question. They have no good answer. My third response to this argument is think about the education freedom accounts. It's only about a quarter of the total spending. Well, government schools end up with higher per-pupil revenues and expenditures. If you lose the full student, but you only lose a quarter of the funding, and you get to keep thousands of dollars for students you're no longer educating, well, mathematically, you must have higher per-pupil revenues and expenditures. So it doesn't defund the public schools. If anything, they're actually more well-funded as a result of this. I mean, just imagine if you stopped shopping at Safeway. Do you guys have Safeways in New Hampshire? Okay, I won't use Walmart. Everybody has Walmart, right? All right. So if you stopped shopping at Walmart, started going to Trader Joe's, you guys got Trader Joe's? All right, cool. I like Trader Joe's. So if you started going to Trader Joe's for whatever reason, what if Walmart got to keep 3/4 of your kids, of your grocery funding each week? Be a good deal for Walmart. I'd argue this is a good deal for the government schools that they get to keep any money at all for students they're no longer educating. Then they'll say, oh, but we got fixed costs, right? We got the buildings we got to maintain. We got the lights we got to keep on. Well, figure it out. It's not my problem. But the other response is, look, every single business has fixed costs. Private schools have fixed costs. Does that mean that they get to keep your tuition payments after you leave? No. All costs are variable in the long run. All costs vary with the unit of production. And Walmart, they have fixed costs. They have the buildings they have to maintain. They have the lights they got to keep on. Did they get to keep your grocery funding after you start shopping somewhere else? No. So the school shouldn't be entitled to your money just because they have fixed costs either. And the reality is they have more than enough money to cover these short-run fixed costs anyway. They get to keep a ton of the funding. And another argument you'll hear that's kind of tangential to this one is that this is going to destroy the public schools. Well, if it is, maybe they deserve the destruction. But that's not how things play out. There are 27 studies on this topic nationwide, and 25 of the 27 studies have found statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the kids' outcomes in the government-run schools. Even government-run schools up their game in response to competition. School choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. We haven't seen the destruction of government schools as a response to the competition. They start to do a better job. And there's actually been 5 studies on the topic finding that school choice competition leads to higher teacher salaries in the public schools because they start to allocate more resources towards the classroom instead of towards administrative bloat and staffing surges. I mean, just think about it. This is another reason why the teachers' unions, we need to differentiate the unions from the teachers themselves because they don't really represent the teachers very well. They make them look bad on a national level, calling for all these ridiculous progressive policies that don't align with all the teachers in the system, but they don't even push for policies that benefit individual teachers. Just think about Ben Scafferty's report from, it's called Back to the Staffing Surge. He's at Kennesaw State University. Between 1992 and 2014, per-pupil education expenditures increased by about 27% after adjusting for inflation. Teacher salaries actually dropped by 2% over the same period. So I do feel kind of bad for some of the teachers when they argue that they have to pay out of pocket for supplies each year. But the problem isn't with their competition. The problem is with their employer that happens to be a massive geographic monopoly that doesn't have any good right incentives to allocate the resources efficiently. So if you have more competition in the market for goods and services, obviously that's great for customers and families and kids, but competition in the labor market is obviously good for employees at the same time. There's essentially a monopsony in the labor market for K-12 education. And they want more school choice. Yeah, me too. We only have a little bit of school choice in New Hampshire. You have the education freedom accounts. A step forward from here might be that, look, this is only a quarter of the... What's also funny is the same people who vote against school choice constantly will say, well, that's only $4,600. That's not enough money to go to this private school over here. Well, there's tuition discounts at the private schools that even if this is the sticker price, they offer discounts for lower income families. I'll usually come back to them and say, would you oppose Pell Grants just because they don't cover the full cost of attending Harvard? And they'll come back and say, well, no, I want to, or they'll pivot to another argument because these are the same people who support increasing funding for Pell Grants. The reality is helping someone a quarter of the way or half of the way is better than not helping them at all, especially when we're already spending the funding at government-run institutions. I'd rather allocate that to people and let them decide. But then I'll also ask them, well, would you support increasing the voucher amount to the amount that's spent in the government schools? No, that's defunding public. They'll just go back to the same their main argument, which is we just want our monopoly to keep as much funding as possible. It's never really about any of these other arguments. They'll also bring out the this is separation of church and state issue. Has anybody heard this one? This is public money. There's no such thing as public money. It's taxpayer money that is taken from you by the government. But they'll make the argument that this is public money going to private religious schools. That is a separation of church and state issue. But it's not. It does not violate the Establishment Clause for the same reason that Pell Grants don't violate the Establishment Clause, even though you can use a Pell Grant to go to Notre Dame or any other religious private university. And the reasoning behind that is that the funding goes to people, and they can choose between religious and non-religious institutions. I mean, you could also, kind of try to conjure up an argument against food stamps for the same reason. You could take the money and then spend it at a service at a church. And would that be a separation of church and state issue? No, because the funding goes to the family, and then they can choose how to allocate the resources. And we actually have Supreme Court precedent on this in 2002, Zellman versus Simmons-Harris. They ruled on an Ohio voucher program suggesting that did not violate the Establishment Clause for the same reason. It goes to people. You can pick religious or non-religious institutions. And then we also had in 2020 the Espinoza v. Montana decision ruled in our favor as well, that if you have a private school choice program, you actually cannot exclude schools simply because they are religious. And New Hampshire had a program like that, the town tuitioning program, that when it first started, did it allow private religious schools, or was this a different state? So you could only, if you didn't have a public school in your town, you could take the funding to pay for private school tuition and fees, but it had to be a non-religious private school. Well, it's essentially discriminating against religious families. That flies in the face of the Espinoza v. Montana decision, and the legislature, I believe, passed a bill allowing families to take the funding to religious private schools as well if they'd like. There's another Supreme Court case right now, Carson v. Macon, has to do with Maine. Maine is the state that had a town tuitioning program as well that could be used at any type of religious or non-religious private school, but then in the 1980s, I believe, they scaled it back to only being for non-religious private schools, and we believe that's going to go in our favor as well. They already heard the arguments in December of 2021, and we expect the ruling to go our way in June. The ruling should come out. How much time do I have left? 22 minutes. Yeah, okay. So 2 minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A or something. But look, these are the main arguments that they'll put forward over and over again, and it's all about power. They just want to keep the kids in their schools, regardless of how well they do. One of the arguments that I have to hit on, because we're at the Liberty Forum, is an argument that I've put forth as well, especially when I was at the Cato Institute, which is, this is government money. There might be strings attached to the taxpayer funding, and wouldn't this not be a step in the right direction if now this invites regulations into the home, and it might invite regulations into the private school? My quick response to that is that this is the argument that makes the perfect the enemy of the good. And the reality is about 9 out of 10 kids are stuck in highly regulated, highly government operated and controlled schools, and this would still be a step in the right direction even if there was a small amount of regulations. Second response is that this is all voluntary. You don't have to take the money. And each individual family can make the cost-benefit decision for their own families. And if they see that the regulations are too costly to be a meaningful, to outweigh the benefits of the funding, well, then they can turn down the money. And no one should ever be forced. I've seen no private school choice program that forces families or schools to participate each year. And in fact, in Louisiana, they have a program that's pretty highly regulated. And in the first year, 2 out of every 3 private schools chose not to participate because of those costs associated with regulations. And look, the supply of education providers is not fixed. I'd rather have a market of private schools and education providers that have varying degrees of regulations than essentially no private providers at all, because they're having to compete with a free good, the government schools that cost tons of money, over $19,000 per kid per year. And it's amazing that we have any private schools at all, that they have to compete with these free institutions that cost a ton of money. Just imagine if the government were going around giving away $300,000 cars for free and then trying to be a car dealership. It would be amazing if any of them existed at all. Well, and by the way, those $300,000 cars, they don't actually run. They don't look any good. It's the Model T still. And we need more money. It'll get better. But things never change. So that's, and then look, also with this argument about the regulations, look, it's all voluntary. And at the same time, the government can try to regulate private education with or without an ESA program or a school choice program. And I think a better way to defend against future regulations is to get more people participating in private education. We saw this with another silver lining of COVID. When the schools closed, people got some type of taste of homeschooling. No, it wasn't all homeschooling. Some of it was government schooling at home, which is not the same thing. It was involuntary. People weren't ready to transition into that. But at the same time, families started to get more confidence with home-based education. It started to become more mainstream. And EdChoice partnered with Morning Consult. It used to be called the Friedman Foundation. They changed the name after Milton and Rose passed away based on their request. But they did polling nationwide, just asking people, how have your views about homeschooling changed since relative to the pre-pandemic levels? And each and every month since April of 2020, they repeated the survey and found every single month that people were over twice as likely to say that they were more favorable of homeschooling as opposed to being less favorable of homeschooling. I believe most of the polls found a 4-to-1 ratio, that people were over 4 times as likely to say more favorable than less favorable. And the point that I'm trying to get at is if people are more favorable to the idea, they'll be less likely to call for regulation of homeschooling or private education. And also, if you get more people participating in the experience, it will be more mainstream, one, but then two, you'll have more people, a bigger tent to defend against future regulations when other members of society try to use the force of government to regulate private education. So I think that's where we should open it up to questions. I know there's a lot of people in the room. There are other arguments against school choice I'm sure everybody's heard, but this is a relatively friendly audience. I'm sure you've heard all these arguments before. Other one is that private schools aren't accountable. Underperforming private schools shut down. Underperforming government schools get more money. And the only real form of accountability is bottom-up accountability, allowing families to vote with their feet to the institutions that work best for them. Private providers of education are directly accountable to families, and that's much better than red tape, which is not accountability. We should stop talking about regulations as if they're a form of accountability when they aren't really. So let's open it up.
I actually, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about.
Clap, clap, clap. You cut off my clap. No more questions. No.
Did not want to take that from you. The phrase "fund students, not systems" is fantastic. I have used that myself on Twitter as a zinger after seeing you use it. How did you come up with that? Was that like a brainstorming session? Did you enlist someone to come up with that? I think it's brilliant. Where'd it come from?
Yeah, I think I popularized it, but I think other people have used it even before me. I don't know the first use of the term, but it really started to click in my head to start using this because it's more transparent than school choice, right? With school choice, what the hell do you mean by that? Fund students, not systems gets to the concept of the money following the child, which people in the school choice movement were already saying these kinds of things, just not as much. They were saying, yeah, have the money following the child, have backpacks full of cash, follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. The other reason I like to say this is because it puts the other side on defense. When you say fund students, not systems, and you want to oppose that, now I'm in a weird predicament to where I'm trying to, the burden of proof is on me now to say why we should fund the buildings and not the kids. And I don't think the union is used to that. They're used to being on offense, and the school choice proponents were on defense for a long time, trying to explain why we should change the status quo. And typically that's been that was one of the challenges. But now if we can just use linguistic techniques to flip it, the burden of proof on the other side, I think that's been very helpful. The other reason it's been helpful is because you can pull in these other programs that do fund people and not buildings. And it really just stops the other side in their tracks because most of this opposition is coming from people that support funding individuals as opposed to institutions with everything else, higher education. Like, why is it different for pre-K, for the K through 12, but not for pre-K? And What changes in those in-between years? And I've seen people on the other side just stop in their tracks because they're like, yeah, I do support Pell Grants. I do support the Head Start program. I mean, the other side might come back and say, well, you're the hypocrite because you don't support expanding Pell Grants. You don't support, they might try to say this to the libertarian crowd, right? You might not support expanding food stamps. Well, I'm not making an argument about whether we should fund these things. I'm arguing that if we do, it should go to people and not buildings. I'm not making, when they try to flip it back on us to try to say, no, you're the actual person that's not getting it right, not being consistent. Being totally consistent because I'm not making an argument whether we should fund it at this level or that level. I mean, it's been helpful, and you can bring analogies in, and whether we like it or not, we want all of this to be about just having the best arguments, but for the vast majority of the population, if you can't convince them in 2 seconds in a soundbite, you've lost the argument. If you're explaining, you're losing, especially when you're the one trying to argue for change. So do it, like, if you're not on Twitter, I mean, maybe it's good because it's bad for your mental health in some ways. But the benefit that I've seen is that it helps you craft your arguments in a way that can convince the general population. If you can't put it into a little tweet, you're going to lose. If you're sitting there trying to someone that's not really interested in what you're trying to talk about, you're going to lose the public debate. And so this is a battleground, a testing ground for arguments online. So I think that's helped me craft my arguments as well. I mean, Twitter's bad in a lot of ways, but that's one of the few benefits of being on that platform. And then some people are like, oh, you're not convincing the people you're arguing with. It's like, I'm not trying to convince the person that I'm arguing with. I'm trying to make them look bad so that the third party wants to be on my side and not the teachers union side. And look, I've said it a million times, I have the easiest job in the world because the teachers unions have been able to just repeat the same stupid talking points over and over again without pushback. And then we've tried to say, we've tried to over-explain things, and that hasn't been very successful. But if you can just point out hypocrisy or logical inconsistencies on the other side, that is more powerful than, so like the rhetorical question that gets me blocked all the time. That's more powerful than saying, no, but actually it doesn't defund the public school. You've already lost if that's your argument. So whenever you can, try to put the burden of proof on your intellectual opponent, and then you'll usually win.
Hi, Corey. Thanks for coming. I think your Twitter feed is really great, too. But I just wanted to ask, though we can dominate our opponents on Twitter pretty easily at this point with the numbers, now we're starting to get choice options, and I'm noticing that a lot of people in the community don't actually know about these choice options yet, like EFAs or whatever. So do you have, what resources have you seen be most effective in letting know my neighbor that there's this other option they can explore and helping them take advantage of that?
Go ask Kate Baker. She has all the on-the-ground knowledge. No, she has been processing lots of applications and helping families get things done on the ground. So I've provided air support, right, in different states, but you have to have these local grassroots groups doing the real work, in my opinion, honestly, to get people educated about the options being available. And I will just say that once options become available, over time, more and more people will have an incentive to explore what they are. There was a study by Cornell researchers in 2017, I don't remember the journal, but they found, and this isn't going to surprise the people in this room, but for the educrats it did, that when school choice was implemented in a location, online searches for school quality increased in that location. Oh, so if I have a choice now, I'm going to research that choice now? Yes. So a lot of people will say, you have to have parents that are involved in education for this to work. Well, one way to do that is to incentivize them to become more involved in the education, and that is to give them the opportunities and make those opportunities available. But there's a lot of different ways to inform families about this. One way that we've been doing it at American Federation for Children, either to rally around a bill or to defend a bill, like is happening right now in New Hampshire, is we have something called the Education Freedom Pledge. And so you can, from any state, sign up educationfreedompledge.com. And if there's a bill that we want people to rally around in their state, you'll get an email about it or a text message about it so that we can get people rallying around the same thing. You can have online groups. I mean, if you don't like Facebook, there's other platforms as well. But a lot of parents have started these Facebook groups to share information. I mean, I remember right when the school closures started in San Francisco, they had something called, what was it? Learning Pods was the name of the Facebook group. No one really knew what the heck a learning pod was at first, but it was really an interesting lesson in spontaneous order. When the government stopped providing something that people wanted, individuals started grouping together and solving the problem voluntarily. And one way that they did that was this Pandemic Pods group in San Francisco even. In a matter of a month or two, it had over 30,000 people join the group. So that's a good way. So, like, social media is horrible in so many ways, but it can help people come together and share information. And go to Kate for more information on what to do to expand these opportunities to more families.
So obviously we all love education freedom and school choice and all of that. But something that's been on the national sort of stage has been the school boards and the parents with their. And a lot of people in this room, I think, homeschool their kids, or maybe they don't have kids. Do you think would you suggest that if they have a passion to still run for school board? And if so, how would they go about it? What's like an effective form of messaging for that? Because it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I don't do much with the school boards, but I would say, hey, if you want to take over the school boards, that's all more power to you. At the end of the day, though, one, what if you lose? Two, what if you're not in the majority? Three, what if you decide something as a school board and there's implementation problems where the teachers are still teaching whatever they want to teach, and all this time goes by and you still have kids stuck in government-run schools? So I think it's a step in the right direction to push for school board, but I think the better solution is to channel all that energy towards expanding the money following the child, because that's, again, like I alluded to earlier, the only real form of accountability is having people vote with their feet. I mean, just imagine if we all had residentially assigned grocery stores. I know I use it too much, but got to simplify things. And we all had a board that we ran for to determine the one size bag of groceries that everybody had to receive. Well, whatever you decided on, you're going to have a large segment of the population that's not happy. It's going to cost a lot of money. And how long is it going to take to win those races? And you really shouldn't have that set up at all. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And that's another thing I didn't even hit on, is that all of these problems we've seen bubble up over the past 2 years, whether it's the curriculum disagreements, whether it's remote versus in-person. Some families liked remote learning, even though it caused a lot of harm to a lot of kids. It was more like remotely learning for a lot of kids because they didn't really have a lot of learning going on. Or whether it was this mask mandate or this kind of mitigation strategy, they're all just symptoms of the larger problem, which happened to be a one-size-fits-all system. The only way out of that, through freedom rather than force, is bottom-up accountability. But I see people, pushing back at the school board meetings. That's another, do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And the National School Board Association at this point should change their name to the Regional School Board Association. New Hampshire was one of the first states that had their school board state-level association pull from the NSBA. Everybody's familiar with this story. The moral of the story is don't call potential customers domestic terrorists. It's not a good idea. The moral from Virginia was don't tell parents they shouldn't be telling schools what they should teach. The moral for the NSBA is to don't label parents as domestic terrorists for pushing back at school board meetings. And the backstory on that was that the NSBA actually colluded with the Biden administration. They ended up sending a letter to the Biden administration implying that some parents should be labeled as domestic terrorists. That didn't work very well for them. At this point, today, there's 21 state-level school board associations that have ended their membership or their funding. So 21 states in less than half of a year, which goes to show you, again, that if parents want to get something done, they have power in numbers, and they can push back. But you can't do it on your own. It's like a coordination problem, right? You want to use these online platforms, use all of this energy, partially towards school board flipping the seats, but also towards the better solution, in my opinion, which is school choice, having the funding follow the student. But you're not going to get anything done unless you band together. If you just go by yourself and complain to the school board or whatever you want to do, that might not lead to real change. So it's I I think I don't know, it makes me motivated just seeing all these parents pushing back nationwide, and it gives me hope for future change, but it really depends on the parents on the ground getting together and pushing back.
Hey, so the last question was one of the two main opponents that I think are principally you're working against. One is the school board, which you just addressed, and the other is the teacher unions. They've been doing a great job making themselves look awful.
Randy Weingarten needs to get an award for being the School Choice Advocate of the Year in 2021.
Right.
Doing my job for me. Thank you so much, Randy.
But the principal issue that I see is that those ranks are continually being filled, and the teachers that go in there are almost just by nature of how it's set up, immediately co-opted into this opposing horde. I'm kind of wondering if you're aware of any programs or any strategies to kind of divert that pipeline of new credentialed educators from going immediately into this status maul of the teachers unions, and if there can be like more attractive options for freshly minted credentialed teachers to go into something that doesn't put them almost immediately into that co-opted opposition group. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer to this, right? I mean, there's alternative certification. I don't know if you guys have that in New Hampshire already. A lot of states do. So that helps, and it's not just a pipeline from the ed schools. But yeah, I mean, this is a problem. I hinted at a study earlier showing that the funding goes up, but the teacher salaries are flat or even go down in some cases. And part of that is the reason is that the union bosses have an incentive just to put more people into the buildings because of what he just said. It allows for more dues-paying members, a larger voting block. And so the incentives of the union bosses like Randy Weingarten, who make over $560,000 a year, are not the same as the incentives of the teachers on the ground. If you look at data coming out with the 2022 school budgets, I don't have the numbers for New Hampshire, Frank might, but in Los Angeles public schools, for one, they're going to be increasing their per pupil spending by about 69% over the past few years. Nice, yeah. And at the same time, they lost 6% of their school-age population, and district officials said that they were going to plan to increase the number of teachers in the buildings by 8%, the number of custodial workers in the buildings by 25%, and the number of psychological/support workers by 80%. In what other industry do you lose 6% of your customer base and then you increase staffing by 80%? It just goes to show you that that's what we're up against, right? And what they're going to do when the federal funding dries up is they're creating this new special interest group, right? And they're going to say, you want to fire all these great people, these social workers in the schools? You got to ratchet up the funding so that we don't have to fire people. And so they're doing that. I think a good way to push back is, again, pushing for school choice, which gives them incentives to not add to administrative bloat and staffing surges, which we've seen in about 5 studies now. They put more money towards existing employees in the system instead of putting more people into the system. Thanks. Got like 1 minute?
Yeah.
Speed round.
It seems as though maybe during the last 2 years we missed an opportunity because, I've opposed all this corona nonsense, but I'll just say, but then I hear people talk and I say, oh yeah, schools are dangerous. We got to keep them closed. Why didn't we do more of that? I mean, this was really an opportunity to destroy the system as much as we could have.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this argument too, and at the same time, society is set up in a way, and parents have structured their lives around this being available, right? The public school system being available to kind of take care of their kids throughout the day and maybe get some education on the side. And when there was a quick shift and the schools closed, parents were scrambling and they had to figure it out. And there were these silver linings, right? Homeschooling has doubled. There's been a mass exodus. A lot of people went to private schools. Charter school enrollment increased by about 7%. Government school enrollment decreased by 3%. So at the end of the day, having the choice of in-person versus remote is a very low bar. And we should expand that to whether you want this type of school or that type of school. So look, I don't know. I don't want to harm families by not giving them a choice just to say, oh, well, we push to keep the schools closed for longer. I'm not going to actively push for that when there were real consequences associated with that. Even if you don't like the government school system, people should have that choice for in-person versus not. But at the same time, there were these unintended benefits.
I just have a couple of comments about school boards. So I'm going to start with the National School Boards Association that you talked about.
Regional school boards. They're now the regional.
Yes. Well, one region. Whatever. So I'm part of an organization called the School District Governance Association, and we wrote a letter to the New Hampshire School Board Association to call them out. And it was right after that they pulled out. So we're going to take credit for that.
Let's go.
But I want to add to that the New Hampshire School Boards Association sucks. Okay, so in response to the guy asking about being on school boards, if you're a minority, you're at least sharing your voice to those other people on the school board. They never heard these arguments before. They need to hear what's going on. So if you know anybody who's running for school board, wants to run to school board, come talk to me. Go talk to Moms for Liberty. They have a branch in Manchester in particular, but let's expand them around the state. And let's get more people on school boards, because right now that's striking while the iron is hot. So.
And when I'm talking about parents banding together, that's a great example of what you should be doing. So thanks for coming out, and thanks for your work pushing for parents. All right, thanks, guys.